Hi, Joanna. It is so good to have you on the podcast. It is our
What a
joy.
privilege. Thanks. I love
Oh,
getting to be here with you.
it is fun when we have real life friends join us that also happen to be experts in whatever we are talking about. And we have a lot we want to cover in the next few minutes. But first, I would like you to tell us where you are reporting from in the world, and specifically where you're sitting right now and how it pertains to what we're talking about today.
Yeah, so my day job is that I direct events and sponsorships at the Denver Institute for Faith and Work, which is a local nonprofit with a national reach that helps people learn about why their work matters to God. And so I'm broadcasting from the Denver Institute offices. I'm in a little workroom that we have, so it's not a very exciting backdrop if anybody's watching on YouTube. And it's mission control. There are about 4 of us here in the office working today. We wear our masks anytime we leave the office, but we decided to come back to work. So we're in the office 2 days a week and working from home 3 days a week.
Okay, so why don't you tell us a little bit about the Denver Institute for Faith and Work? Because I do feel like the word Denver in there, it's based here where we both live, which is why we know each other in real life.
Yeah.
But I feel like it's a misnomer a little bit because it is having a national reach. So can you tell us about the kinds of things that you put out as a group and how you're talking about faith and work in general for the world?
Yeah, so the Denver Institute is part of a growing movement that's happening nationally. We call it the Faith and Work Movement. And it's drawn from this conviction that the gospel touches individual lives. You know, all of us have the opportunity to respond to Christ and have a relationship with him. But we believe in a big gospel, the idea that through Christ's death and resurrection, he's making all things new. Any area of our world that has been influenced by sin or doesn't display the beauty of God and the way he intended life to be is a place that's ripe for influence of restoring, renewing, gospel creativity. And so our mission is to help people understand that if all of the world matters to God, then our work, which touches any area of life, matters to God. And so we create programs and opportunities for people to begin by thinking and having a good framework for understanding work in the picture and how it fits in our lives as Christians, but also to drill in very specifically about different industries. Like, what does it mean to be a city planner? Like, how do you build the kind of city where everyone can flourish who lives there? And how does that imply parking rates or the way you pour your curbs or the way you organize your parks? That's a practical example. Or if you're a doctor, how does your Christian faith inform the way that you actually practice medicine? So we have very specific conversations with people to help them think more deeply about how God views the specifics about their work. And we do that through programs like our 5280 Fellowship, which is an intensive discipleship program for folks here in the Colorado area. But we do public events, one of which is our Women Work and Calling event, which is why I love to be part of this conversation with you. We host one called Business for the Common Good, where you'll have 400 business leaders from across Colorado and increasingly across the country coming together to talk about how can God be working through business. And not just, hey, I want to put a Jesus fish on my business card, or I want to share my faith and love on my employees. That's a wonderful starting point. But we want to talk about how does the gospel actually transform the systems and the way that we think about business. And it's amazing. I've had some local pastors attend events like that, and they're like, I have never thought about the broad implications of God at work in our world like I do when I come together with you at that event. So we do a fellowship and events. We do a ton of writing. We have a podcast called the Faith and Work Podcast. So we're a bunch of thinkers, but we also are very practical people too. We're committed to doing, and what does it look like to live out the Christian faith in our world? So it's an amazing opportunity, and we're part of a conversation that's happening all around the country on this.
It's really unique and very I like the one of a kind approach. I haven't really heard it in that way before, or anyone talking about it in that way. Can you give us some examples of the way people have shifted their mindset as they have listened to what you have to say and they've internalized it and thought deeper about their purpose at work? Can you give us maybe an example or two of how that's been done?
I think those are great examples. So imagine you're a business owner. One thing that can be a very powerful reflection of your faith is intentional hiring. And so we're often pressing into our business leaders to say, hey, is there a place within your company where you could create work? And you may need to provide some some supportive structures that go along with it, that you could create a good job for someone that may be struggling to be employed. And when you think about changing someone's life, we often want to see somebody, Alex knows, because your family has been involved in helping people rebuild their lives. It's really hard to rebuild your life if you don't have a good job. Not only do you have you lack the financial stability, but work is part of our God-given identity. We see that in the very early pages of scripture in Genesis. And so for a person to live out their fullness, they need to be engaged in productive, creative work. That doesn't always mean paid employment. So if a woman's listening and her work is in the home, that's a beautiful picture of godly productivity. But for people to really rebuild their lives, they need to be engaged in productive work. And so an employer, by creating a supportive structure that could come alongside someone to help them get practical job skills, and also maybe the soft skills that they need to thrive at work, can really change somebody's life. And it's a beautiful picture of loving your neighbor. So that's a practical example that we preach a lot. I think of other people we know, all of the folks that go through our fellowship program have a practical project built into that. And so I think of one of our fellows that was hired to be leading operations for a giant chain locally of car dealerships. And so he was positioned in a very powerful place, and he had the resources to think about HR policies and operations for the entire network of dealerships. And so he sat down and said, okay, as I think about this through a lens of faith, what would be loving to the people we employ? What would be loving to the customers that we serve? And they can evaluate all of the daily operations of that car dealership through that philosophy. And so suddenly it starts to get very, very practical and have a big impact in people's lives. And amazingly, it has an impact in the bottom line too, which is fun to see. So sometimes people just need to be invited to see their faith more broadly, the work of Christ more broadly, and have some practical tools to live it out. And we get to do that.
Yeah. I just think that question is so wonderful. What would be more loving, or what would be a loving way to approach this? Knowing that these are people that work for for-profit companies that need to make a profit. So you still have to make those practical decisions. So our listeners today may be listening to this series because they are in a position where they're needing to make some practical decisions around their work and their work-life balance and how they do that. And COVID has thrown some of us for a loop in some of these areas of scheduling and being at home and protecting people we love and income. All of those things have affected families in very real ways. Before we jump into the COVID element of our discussion, can you just talk about how you see women in the workplace, what unique traits women bring to work when they're going and they're working with coworkers? And maybe, I know these are huge questions, but just very briefly too, how you see women leading in the marketplace.
Yeah. So I'm going to start at the high level, and then I'm going to go practical. So this is part of an ongoing conversation I've been leading here at Denver Institute around women, work, and calling. And one thing that I have found is that very few Christian women have a solid theological foundation for thinking about how daily work fits into their life of faith. And so it's vital to go back to those early pages of Genesis where we see men and women made in God's image and entrusted with the work of caring for and developing creation. That's long before Christ was talking about saving souls, God was commissioning us to engage the created world and make something of it. And what's so powerful about that is that we see that that's an invitation that's given to both men and women. And so we see that framework. We also see biblically the model of Proverbs 31, which is one of those passages that women tend to love or hate because it's such a beautiful picture of women, but it can be also guilt-inducing because you kind of go, how do I see myself in this? It's really important to remember that that is the pinnacle of a book of wisdom. And so the model that we see in Proverbs 31 is not limited to women. It's a model of biblical productivity, of an integrated life that brings together family responsibilities, that brings together love of neighbor, as you see the work that woman's doing. And so you see this relational care of family and neighbor. You also see economic engagement that supports a family and supports a community. And so you see this beautiful integrated view of the different roles that a woman or a man could fill. And so when we start kind of with that lens, you realize like, women are made to work. And I want to be really clear, when I say work, it doesn't mean always getting a paycheck. But our productivity, our giftedness, our calling starts there of how do we engage the world God's given us. But then it's really important to think through some of the historic and cultural things that have begun to distort our perspective. And I think that's where a lot of Christian women struggle, is that depending on your family background, if you happen to grow up in a religious community, you may have perspectives that are unique to your denomination or church that shaped how you think about that. And every woman finds herself at a different place on a spectrum of the role that they think work will play in their own lives. And so one of the things that we do is we want to help women say, what does that look like for me to fully steward the gifts and the resources that God's given me over the scope of my life? And I know, Alex, you and I have had that conversation of, it looks different sometimes when your kids are really little. The intensity of your home focus is so fierce in those years. Or as you're beginning to move towards empty nesting, suddenly you have new freedoms to be engaging work. And so we need to be able to have a language and a vision for women that helps us think about stewarding our gifts in light of those unique constraints that all of us have in your life. Or maybe somebody like me, I happen to be single and in my mid-40s, and am just coming to terms with the fact that motherhood, traditional motherhood, won't be a part of my life. And so all of a sudden I realized, oh gosh, I need a vision for my life that's broad enough to encompass the reality of where I am. I have much fewer constraints than my peers because I don't have children of my own at this stage. So I need a vision for work that's robust enough to encompass all of those different stages. And so we're passionate about helping women do that. Practically speaking, that means really pushing into some of the things that are challenging. I often think I can talk a good game about faith and work and women and calling, but the reality is it's really complex trying to navigate those roles. It is not an easy thing for women because we do have conflicting responsibilities. In this season of COVID, it's even more complicated because all of these different callings that many women are juggling, of some that's working, some that's outside the home, some that's being a mother and a wife and a neighbor, all of those are colliding in one household. And so it can be challenging to figure out how do we juggle those things.
Well, so talk a little bit more about that very tension. I think women do have things pulling at them in a different way than men do in the workplace. And so how do you recommend that women even navigate that? Just the pull that they feel toward their families and their home and taking care of all the things that, I mean, I think as women, we juggle, a million plates at one time. And then we're also trying to work. Now, whether that's volunteer work or paid work, we often are doing things that are work under the umbrella of work.
I'm thinking of kind of three principles to be thinking about. One is the idea of invisible labor. And this is a term that sociologists often use, and it's acknowledging the work that women do that's often unseen and unpaid. It would be things like if your child gets sick, you run them to the doctor, or maybe you have an aging parent, you need to stop by their apartment or where they're being cared for in assisted living to make sure that they're okay. They're the things like who makes sure the grocery list gets composed and the field trip permission slip gets
exactly.
signed.
Exactly.
I call it's very much like a third career for many women, and that's being project management of your household and family. And so I think it's important to acknowledge, this is an additional load that women always carry. But in this time of COVID, we have an opportunity to actually see that. And what's been fascinating for me is that because many men are home with women to a degree, imagine a two-parent family who are both working outside the home, all of a sudden they're in the house together and looking at each other's careers. People have said, whoa, I realize my husband's kind of a jerk and how he treats his coworkers because I'm hearing him on these conference calls. Or a husband is maybe home to a degree that he's seeing that invisible labor and the scope of that it plays in a wife's life for the first time ever, and is more positioned to be able to respond to that. And so by raising that idea of invisible labor, I realize it can create conflict for people. It means that people are going to have tough conversations. So I'm sending you into the buzzsaw if this is an issue that you're confronting. I'm not providing a solution, but I'm raising the issue for you. But it is a real thing. And I was really encouraged by an article I saw in the New York Times recently that some men are becoming more sensitive and aware of what the women in their lives are carrying because they're seeing it for the first time. And so there is an opportunity there, if we're willing to press through the discomfort of talking about co-laboring in the work of raising a family. So I think that's one thing. A practical thing that women can do that is rising in this season is that in the past, women at times have been penalized because they don't show up as the ideal worker. And I pulled out a little quote for you if you'll let me read it. This was from an article also in the New York Times. Social scientists have a description they call the ideal worker norm. And so what that means is that in a typical workplace, the ideal worker would come in early, they'd stay late, they never have a sick kid or a parent that needs to be taken care of. And women are more likely to have those care responsibilities. So that often can penalize a woman who's in a more traditional corporate setting because it's not as easy to show up at work for 40 hours, 45 hours uninterrupted. You need some of that flexibility. Well, with this move to laboring from home, we're seeing an amazing thing, and that people are being productive at home. Now, I know it's been really hard for some women and men because of the complication of having kids around the house. But the idea that remote work can be productive and valuable is an amazing opportunity for women. And so a practical thing, if one of our listeners finds herself in this spot, is that you can be an advocate for yourself. Start making a list of thinking of ways that you have demonstrated excellence and productivity in the midst of your remote work and saying like, hey, I need to show you practically, like, my work has not been effective. I have been a team player and have gotten done what needed to be done in a season. And so you can advocate for yourself with an employer to say like, hey, I would like to propose a 60-40 work schedule where I'm working from home 3 days a week and I'm at the office too. That's a very practical way that this crazy season has presented opportunities for women. So that's
and we just often
exciting.
don't ask. We often don't advocate or say, hey, give me a shot with this, like give me a trial run. Let me go run with this. And so a part of it is just really finding that voice, which we're just coming off of a Honing Your Voice series, but really finding that voice to advocate for yourself in that way as a woman.
Yeah, it's powerful. And Alex, you had said, what are some of the strengths that women bring to the workplace? I mean, it's amazing. And I love that there are data-driven academic studies that show how companies thrive when they have women in leadership. They perform better financially. They avoid ethics violations, which I think is fascinating, but like the numbers don't lie. Like business is better when you create a place where both men and women can steward their gifts. But I think women, sometimes we don't know how to articulate what we bring. And so a practical thing that we can be doing is beginning to understand our voice and contribution, and that it may be different than the men that we work with, and knowing how to spot it in ourselves and be able to articulate it to others. I still struggle with that in my own life. And I'm thankful to have some men and women in my life that call that out in me and help me see things in my own life that I don't always see in myself.
Mm-hmm. And that could be a practical thing women can do, is to go to coworkers and say, listen, I'm having a hard time coming up with my list of assets that I bring. What are the assets that you see that I bring to the group? And if you're going to trusted people that want the best for you, they're going to pull out those positives to help you at least start to get that brainstorm going.
Yeah. And that's something a woman in any role can do. Like often these studies are for women that are in the corporate sector, but really like think about any role that you're in. You can be an advocate for yourself of calling to mind the gifts that you have and also actively engaging leadership to be standing up for yourself and creating more opportunities. So it's kind of a learned skill. I think it's part too of learning to negotiate. I am not a good negotiator. So that's a professional skill for me, is that I need to learn to do that. But all of life is a negotiation, and standing up for yourself and articulating with your unique voice, gifts, perspectives, contribution is all part of kind of negotiating to create opportunities for yourself.
Mm-hmm. So good. Okay. Was there a third thing you were going to say?
The third thing was, okay, yeah, thanks for reminding me of my numbers. I get so busy frothing about something. So we're talking about
we got you off
work.
Track.
The opportunities that are presented by this season of working from home. I forget my third point. It'll come back to me. Oh, you know what? The third point was realizing that this issue of schools being closed, and I don't think this is a surprise for anybody, like it's the make or break issue on whether the economy will be able to open. And one thing I think we can do in loving our neighbor, this is important, is that it's not just about advancing ourselves, but as Christians, how can we love our neighbor, is realizing that there are many women who are working in roles where they have lost their only form of childcare when schools closed, and that they can't afford to pay for daycare, or they may lack the structures like a supportive family or grandparent that could take care of kids. And so for them, the reality of what do I do with my kids when I need to go to work? My salary isn't high enough. You know, if you're in a service industry job, you can't afford daycare. It's super expensive. And so realizing that it's really a breaking point for a lot of women around their work. It's important. And so if you are a woman that is in a position to earn, if you're a ministry leader, like if you're at a local church, the critical issue of daycare for women that are in working class or service industry jobs is real. And so that's a wonderful practical way of loving our neighbors. So that's something that we can be called to serve others as it relates to their work.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's great. That's great. Okay. So one of the things I would like to transition a little bit to is just COVID and re-envisioning work. And I feel like you're already touching on that, but I do want us to dive maybe a little deeper into that of what does it look like for us to think creatively about work right now? And what are some, I feel like you're swimming in this every day. So what are some things even you've seen people do? I think you have a lot of interface with people who are already doing this. So can you give us some tips on that and what you see people doing?
Yeah, I think a critical issue for a lot of people is what does it look like? And this is not the outward overflow of work. This is like, what does it look like to be a team and be functioning as a body of employees together? What does it look like to be creating healthy relationships when you're not in physical proximity to each other? I think that question of loving God and loving neighbor is so simple. We can camp out in that any day in the way we go about our lives, and yet so profound in the way that it informs the way that we go about our work and our neighboring. Alex is an expert in that, of like, what does it mean to really love your neighbor? But I think a good question to be asking is, what does it look like to maintain health? Whether you're running a small business or you're an employee in a team or you're a solopreneur, asking like, what does it look like to be loving my coworkers well? What does it look like to be loving the customers that I serve? And I think we're in a season where we need people of faith to be a healing balm, if I could describe it as such. Like, people's hearts are just tired and torn up by this current season. And practically, like, what does it look like to truly create a spirit of love in the way you go about your daily work? And I think that's hard. I'm still wrestling with that personally. I haven't embraced the fullness of what that will mean for the way I go about my work and my neighboring.
Those questions are very relationship focused, but the truth is, once you start to answer them, as you gave the example of the manager of the car dealerships, once you start to answer them, they start to present some practical work nuts and bolts of how you're going to operate. And maybe during this time, if you're answering those questions differently than you did pre-COVID, what they're pointing toward is also a business direction for you. If you are, say, an entrepreneur or a woman who is trying to make some extra money, childcare, for example. I mean, women that are home that are trying to earn money for their families, neighbors need childcare. And how do we provide affordable childcare to our neighbors while at the same time providing income to our family. So, I mean, that's just one of a million examples that as we answer those questions of how do I love God and love my neighbors during COVID, it can start to meet some of the practical needs that a woman might have in her work life or some directional needs for her business, I would think.
Yeah, I was thinking of a practical example. A woman that I know in town named Samantha, she's one of our fellows alumni, works for a refreshment company. And the core of their business pre-COVID was providing fresh food in office buildings and hospitals. So employees could go beyond just, a microwave burrito and actually have a great meal. Well, when the lockdown happened, their business dried up. I think they lost more than 75% of their contracts just because people weren't in office eating. And so the question for them was, are we going to have to close the company, or is there a way that we can pivot? And I love the leadership that Samantha showed, because she said, I think we can take the raw materials of all of these employees, all of these resources of food production. We're just going to have to pivot and find a different audience to serve. And so they've been partnering with local nonprofits and local churches to provide pre-made meals that people can come in and drive up, and for a really affordable price, you can get a meal for a family of 8 that you just take home and you bake. But they also thought about it in terms of loving your neighbors. So for her, loving neighbors meant keeping her staff employed, which was critical. They needed to find a way to create work for the people in their company. And they did that by changing their business model. But by doing it in partnership with ministries and churches, they had a few values. And one was that they wanted to be generous, even though they were really suffering financially. They didn't want to lose their spirit of generosity. And so they committed to giving a portion of the money of any meals that were sold would go into the benevolence fund of that church or ministry they were partnering with. So it was like they were kind of tithing off of their profits back to their partner organizations. And they offered food to anyone that had need in a very dignified way. You didn't have to come up and say, I need a meal, I'm hungry. You could just drive up to the line where the food was being offered and say, I'm on the list. It was a really subtle thing, but allowed your needs to be met in a very dignified way. And so in a really critical season, I love how her commitment to loving neighbors through her daily work was lived out in a really, really practical way. And so there may be ways that women can do that in their leadership, or in a small scale. Like you said, if you're just an individual, you can do that in the way that you are embracing your neighborhood and opportunities that are there.
And I think women thrive in creativity. I mean, that's, a part of, I think, our strength is thinking, in lots of different ways, pulling from different areas and being creative. And so I love that example, because it's the perfect example of creativity and, like you said, generosity, which I think, it's very tempting to go into a scarcity mindset at times like these, especially. It always is. I think we always fight that within ourselves, but especially now where maybe resources are scarce, it's easy to get that hoarding mentality, and where I just have to survive. And to keep that spirit of generosity, I mean, it is a biblical concept that works. It will benefit everyone if we continue to have that generosity mindset. And so I really like that you brought that up.
Yeah. And Alex, you had said, like, how do we start thinking practically? Maybe a way to start is to ask the question, what are the unmet needs that I see? That's just a huge business and marketing principle of saying, what is the unmet need and how am I going to meet that? Is there a practical need right in front of you? They're like, hey, I can do something about that, and I might be able to charge some money to do it.
It's a good question.
Start a list, start a list and come up with 5 to 10 things in your immediate vicinity that you're like, these are needs that people have in ways that I could practically, to use an economics term, monetize a service or a product to meet that need.
Well, it's a great question. And I think so practical, because we're all seeing needs. I mean, it's kind of like when someone invents something that we wish we would have invented because it's been a need that we've had for 10 years. It's like, why didn't I think of that? I just said that yesterday. why didn't I think of that? Washable rugs, this company called Ruggable,
I
and
love
you
that.
can wash the rugs. I'm like, why didn't I think of that? That's such a great concept, right? So I think sometimes Alex and I talk a lot about this idea of a narrowing margin births innovation. When we start to feel that pressure of, no longer are these options available, that's when we really start to innovate. And so I think that's just a great question of what are the needs that I see and how can I innovate within the needs and really serve people by meeting those needs, but also generate income for that as well. So
totally.
That's great.
One thing I thought of that may encourage women that are listening that feel like maybe thinking that way isn't their natural bent. I love listening to a podcast called How I Built This, which is the story of entrepreneurs. It's produced as part of National Public Radio. But one thing that always stands out to me is those entrepreneurs rarely have it all figured out before they get started. They often are in a fairly desperate strait, but they have a good idea that they think has legs. And often the plan changes as they go along. So it's never a story of like straight line success. Like I had a great idea and off it went. And so that can encourage, your listeners of realizing like, it's a scrappy process, but start looking and trusting your heart and what you see and see if that is an idea that you can run with.
Well, and the other thing I think that's important to recognize is that, because I listen to that podcast sometimes as well, and I also do a lot of reading about different people, and that normally it's like if they almost gave up, they had so many failures along the way that it was like they almost gave up. And then as they pushed through that failure time and time and time again, finally something hit, but it took all this wake of failure for actually success to come. And so just to always remember that failure is okay. And it's actually a part of the process. And I think sometimes we put so much pressure on ourselves that failure is not okay, but it is. It actually is a necessary part of the journey.
Yeah. And that really goes back to thinking about the role that work plays in our lives spiritually too, of realizing that the way that we experience work, work was ideal. It was given to us before sin entered the world. So it's a blessed good thing. But sin has created this very broken relationship that we have with work. And so we often joke here at the office, we use the expression thistles and thorns. Like when the copier is like jacked up and not working normally, we'll be like, darn it, thistles and thorns, because the Bible talks about that. We're going to experience struggle and toil in our daily work, and realizing like the renewing work of Christ in our lives doesn't only happen at church or in our time alone with the Lord. It happens through the purifying effect of work in our lives. And so those moments of fear, of risk, of disappointment are all places that God wants to meet us. He forms us spiritually through our work. And so suddenly your walk with God gets vibrant and colorful, both when you realize the scope of what you're doing every day matters to him, and also that he's actively engaged with you in the nuances of what you're doing every day. I think that gives courage, and also makes you want to press in those hard moments to say, God, how can I experience you here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Just that, going back to James, like, how do I welcome trouble and, hardships of many kinds, these trials, they come and then they develop things in us. They develop perseverance. They develop hope in us. Those are important. Yeah. Well, Joanna, this has been so great. Thank you so much. Are there any last words that you want to encourage women with?
I just would say, realize the unique giftedness that God has given you as individuals, but also the unique role that you play in any organization or neighborhood or family. Like, we need the unique voice and perspective that women offer, even if it's not always welcomed. And so the more you can learn to embody that and articulate the uniqueness that you bring, the better long-term those organizations or neighborhoods will be. And so my challenge is to excel still more, trust God to use your giftedness, and look for opportunities to really accentuate the uniqueness and strength that you can bring to those situations.
I like that a lot. And that whole idea of knowing yourself. And so you may have to ask some people, what am I good at? If you don't know what that is, what am I good at? Take the Myers-Briggs, take the Strengths Finder, take the Enneagram, do all those things that help you to know yourself better so that you know what your gifts are in the world. That's great encouragement. Great.
Awesome.
Well, thank you. This has been so fun to have you on and to finally kind of meet you face to face, Joanna, because Alex
love
has talked
it.
about you so much. So this has been fun to meet you face to face.
You guys are the best. What a privilege to be with you.
All right. Have a great day.